I would like to start off today's presentation by saying how grateful I am to be teaching, living, and learning on the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. It is from learning with and from them that we can incorporate best practices of looking after the land that we are living on and bring quality programs through ocean-wise conservation, education, and research. And so I'm very excited to introduce our host for today's program, Dr. Peter Ross, our Vice President of Research for OceanWise, to tell us a little bit about the awards and our presenter today.
Thanks so much, Danica. Welcome, everybody. Delighted to have Danica and also Amanda in the wings, helping to enable the logistical support for this content. My name is Peter Ross. I'm delighted to be facilitating today and delighted to be introducing the last Ocean Award winner online lecture to you today. The Ocean Awards, for those among you who do not know, were named in support of Dr. Murray Newman, our founding executive director at the Vancouver Aquarium in 1956. He retired in the early 1990s, and the Newman Awards were arranged to showcase the wonderful science to conservation network in British Columbia and further afield. So since 1995, every year we've had the Ocean Awards, and we've had been able to introduce a wonderful series of champions, ocean champions that are out there. That makes this year the 25th anniversary of the Ocean Awards. A little bit of an intimate celebration there for 25 wonderful years. And I'm delighted today to hand the show over momentarily to Dr. Alejandro Frid, who is here on Bowen Island, as am I, in the reaches of Howe Sound. And Alejandro is this year's winner of the Conservation Research Communications Award. And communicating is what we all do in various degrees of freedom. And Alejandro is going to speak to us to his life's passion, which is communicating about the world around him through his eyes and in lockstep with conversations with indigenous communities and through partial lens of Western science, if I could put it that way. I'll let him define his journey, his personal and professional journey, but I'm delighted to hand over to him. And I would encourage people, I'll put this in the chat, to look for his book, Changing Tides, An Ecologist's Journey to Make Peace with the Anthropocene. So without further ado, Alejandro, congratulations, enjoy today, and we look forward to much more in your adventure today and beyond. So over to you.
All right. Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share some stories and ideas with everybody here. I have to admit that I do miss having a live audience. Computers are the sort of thing I use for work and analysis, but in our current world, we have to connect this way. So I'll try and make it as personal as possible for the computer. And I look forward to the next opportunity in which we all can be in one room and sharing stories more directly. So I do have a presentation that I'd like to focus on, and it takes some aspects of the work I've been pursuing over the last little while, which relates, let's call it a component of my bigger journey in working with the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance, for who I am the science coordinator and ecologist. Now, the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance was formed by the Wiikino, Nujulk, Kitsuhehes, and Heiltsuk nations in the early 2000s. And the whole idea here was for these neighboring nations to work together in the proactive management of different human activities that happen within their territories. So really, it was a desire to proactively influence the course of marine biodiversity, of traditional foods, and really about the relationship between people and the marine environment. I have to say that I absolutely love the work that I do with these nations. It puts together my my love of natural history and science with my love of people. And it really does give me an opportunity to contribute in whatever small way I can towards a more equitable world. So I'd like to set the stage for my talk with these two questions. What are fish and who are we? Now, these questions are inextricably linked in many ways. They frame just about everything I do in my work. They bounce inside my brain whenever I'm occupied on some fisheries problem or, some big picture thing that I'm working with the nations. And the potential answers to these questions, are really a reflection of our personal worldviews. They will reflect, how some of us were raised, the books we might have read, the people we might have connected with, the teachers we might have encountered, and really the stories that we've had a chance to live and that might resonate within us all. All of these things will weigh in how we, might reflect on the answers to these questions. And for some, the answers are going to be quite explicit. They're going to be expressed as ways of intentional ways of being in the world. For others, it's going to be more of a default modus operandi for which there seems to be no apparent alternative. But whatever consensus, I believe, we achieve as a society as to how we answer these questions, it's going to affect things in a big way. It's going to affect the course of, biodiversity and humanity's future in quite a substantial way for a long time. So what are fish and who are we? So over the course of this talk, to explore some of these answers, I'm going to often go back to one of my favorite teachers, and that's rockfish, which many of you probably know is a very diverse genus of marine fish. And it's no secret that I love rockfish. I've been working with them for a long time. And sometimes I get in trouble for thinking too much about them rather than other things. But let me give you a sense of why I find them so fascinating. Let's do it by way of example. So in the upper larger frame here, we have a school of yellowtail rockfish. Yellowtail, they don't live that long from a rockfish perspective. They only live about 60 years or so. And they spend a lot of time in the water column, often close to the surface. And as shown in this excellent photograph taken by my colleague Tristan Blaine during one of our dive surveys in the Central Coast, they spend a lot of time feeding on pelagic prey like herring. And I love how this photograph shows the full bellies of the yellowtail rockfish and how they're surrounded by herring. But then in contrast, in the lower left of the screen here, we have black-spotted rawfire rockfish, which are a whole completely different thing. I mean, they live only along the bottom. They occupy very deep depths, 200 to 800 meters deep, as shown in this photograph taken from an ROV survey by DFO scientist Cherise DePriest. And one thing that's astounding about black-spotted rawfire rockfish is they've been aged to 205 years of age. So it's this diversity of lifestyles, life histories that I think makes rockfish quite special teachers about the relationship between humans and the marine environment. And I'll return to that several times over the course of the talk. Now, of course, the longest history of human connection between people and rockfish and other marine resources in our part of the world is that of the indigenous people. So I'd like to introduce you to just a small subset of the folks I've had the privilege of working with over the years, just to personalize the experience a little bit more. So on the upper left here at the helm, we have a 74-year-old at the time, Charlie Mason, hereditary chief Nismukhemas of the Kitassuhehe Nation. And here Charlie is in command of his crew of what he calls the young guys, which they're all about my age or so. And they're bringing up a long line that was set for catching halibut and rockfish. Then in the upper center here, we have Dean Duncan, who's Charlie Mason's son. And Dean here is about 11 years old at the time. And he just baited a whole bunch of hooks with freshly caught herring. And then on the upper right here, we have Ernie Talio from the Nuhulk Nation. And here we are on a beautiful October day in the Bella Coola River. And Ernie is maneuvering a rowboat, and he has a drift net that he's taking down the river to fish for coho. On the lower right here, we are in Klemtu in late March. And so this is herring season. And we have Elmer Scar from the Kitasoo-Hay-Hays Nation, and he's grabbing a big load of herring eggs that have been collecting on hemlock boughs. And this is really an extremely special time of year in these communities, because you have the traditional fishers bringing the harvest of herring eggs and distributing to the community. And as you can see from this photograph, there is quite a bit of joy and laughter involved. It's really a wonderful time to be there. And then in the lower center here, we have Quaylin Jones, who's, I think is 11 years old at the time of the photograph. And there's quite a bit of stories that goes with this image for me. Quaylin here is collecting the seaweed that's known to her people, the Haltsuk, as haggis. And that's the genus Paropia, as it's known in Western science. Now, paropia is an extremely important traditional food. It's used throughout the coast, and there's as many indigenous names for it as there are indigenous languages. But what's also quite significant about paropia is that it's very sensitive to ocean warming. So during the warm years, during the blob of 2016, 2017, paropia harvest basically crashed, which brought quite a bit of cultural hardship to these communities. But fortunately, in 2018, when this photograph was taken, paropia was back in the upswing, and things went back to, for kids like Quaylin to be able to go out and harvest it. And then finally, on the lower left here, we have a very special person, Alvina Johnson from the Wikino Nation. Alvina is a speaker of the Wikala language. She's an avid harvester of traditional foods. You can see her out on the water in all kinds of weather in a really small open skiff, setting crab traps and catching all sorts of fish. So really collectively, what I wanted to convey for these photographs is just a sense of how this very ancient tradition between people and marine biodiversity remains very much alive in a modern context. Now, archaeological evidence indicates that coastal peoples have consumed rockfish for at least 9,000 years, probably a lot longer. And in this image, I'm showing some of the results of work from archaeologists Ian McKechnie and Madonna Moss, who examined middens throughout British Columbia and adjacent areas of Oregon, Washington, and Southeast Alaska. And through this work, they show that, basically the story that bones in the middens told of how people use different species over a period of about 2,500 years. And, perhaps not surprisingly, we have in the upper two bars, salmon and herring as being the most ubiquitous species groups. They're found in just about all middens throughout the coast. But what I find quite interesting with my rockfish bias is that rockfishes were found in about almost two-thirds of the middens that they examined. So this suggests that, rockfish were actually a fairly ubiquitous staple as well. And unlike herring and salmon, which have a seasonal component, rockfishes can be harvested year-round. And the fact that you have this use of rockfish over at least 2,500 years as evidence in these middens is, I find it quite notable because, as I mentioned, some species are very long-lived. The quillback rockfish that shown in this photograph, lives to about 95 years, a max age of about 95 years. So that means that these sorts of long-lived species, grow very slowly. They take a long time to start reproducing, and therefore they're very, very easy to overfish. So, and also most rockfishes are quite easy to catch. So really where I'm going with this is that sustainable use of rockfish over the millennia, it's not something that would just happen by itself. It's not sheer luck that people use rockfish for that long. And especially when you consider that prior to colonization, the coast thrived with human presence. Forensic anthropologists estimate that it was about 100,000 to 200,000 people living along the coast of British Columbia and adjacent areas of Oregon, Washington, and Southeast Alaska. And on top of that, on top of these large human population densities, you had really effective and sophisticated fishing technologies. So sustainable use of marine, species over the millennia, especially of rockfishes, really reflects some really intentional stewardship practices. And then what this image on the right here of Ernie Mason of the Kitasoo Nations tells me is that a lot of these stewardship practices remain pretty much alive in our modern context. There's a transfer and adaptation of these stewardship practices going on. But not all that starts well remains well. During the last part of the 20th century, which is essentially a mere blink of the eye in the history of rockfish and human relationships, pretty much a Wild West scene took place. Commercial fisheries began around the 1950s. They didn't pick up too quickly, but then by the 1980s, the landings really began to ramp up. And they peaked around 1990. And then basically a cliff of depletion was hit, and the landings began to plummet. And then as federal scientists, Lim Yamanaka and Gary Logan later wrote in a retrospective form, things just had essentially gotten completely out of the control of managers. Now, and then rockfish were just a small microcosm of the bigger trend. And just through this collection of graphs, the point is that the trend in Canadian fish stocks in general was one of decline starting in the 1980s. So to address this, general crisis, basically, DFO, our fisheries management agency, around 2009 came up with what's called the Sustainable Fisheries Framework, which certainly was a notable improvement from the lack of a precautionary approach from the past. So the main principles of this framework are listed here on this slide, but the ones I want to highlight are the first two. So the framework establishes a precautionary approach to fisheries management, and it provides the basis for an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. And I want to emphasize that term, ecosystem approach. Now, this is, quite great in theory, but I think we should have a look as to how this has panned out in practice. But before doing so, I need you to come up to speed with just a few terms from fisheries concepts that are relevant to the Sustainable Fisheries Framework. And the first one is that of the historical baseline, which is often defined, not always, but often it's defined as the biomass, which is basically the total weight of reproductive individuals of a species before large-scale commercial fisheries began. And this is a measure of past abundance that's back calculated from estimates of current abundance, from the life history characteristics of the species, and from reconstructing the catches over time. The next concept that's quite important for some of what I'm going to talk about soon is that of maximum sustained fishery yield, or MSY for short. And that's the largest catch that can be taken annually and indefinitely without eroding future fishery opportunities. And this assumes no environmental change, which is, a bit of a stretch given our current warming oceans. And then finally, we have biomass at maximum sustained yield, which is the biomass of reproductive individuals that must be maintained to enable harvest at maximum sustained yield. All right, I know that was a bit of a mouthful, but you'll see how all this fits in. So in the most common application of a sustainable fisheries framework, managers think of three different zones. They want fish to be in what they call the healthy zone, which is 80% or more of the biomass at a maximum sustained yield. And for fish in that zone, it means that harvests are, the higher catch rates are allowed for fish in that zone. And then fish enter what's called the cautious zone, which is between 40 and 80% of biomass, maximum sustained yield. And when fish enter that zone, then catches become much more restricted. And then the critical zone is a place that everybody wants to avoid, and that's where biomass drops below 40% of biomass at maximum sustained yield. And that's where you have the highest restrictions to fisheries. So these are the default thresholds for management. They're not required in the Sustainable Fisheries Framework, but in practice, they're widely implemented. And I find that to be a big concern, and I'll be developing the rationale for that in a bit. But before, I want to point out, this cliche, which I'm sure many of you have heard. Counting fish is like counting trees, except that they are invisible and they keep moving. Well, unlike most other cliches, this one is actually quite true. It's extremely difficult to estimate the abundance of fish underwater. It takes great mathematical prowess. It takes a lot of skill at computer programming, and it's just a real complicated business. So, and I really admire my DFO colleagues that take on this task and do quite well with it. So with some caveats, and maybe we can talk about those later in the discussion, the technical accuracy of stock assessments is not my top concern. What is my top concern is that the Sustainable Fisheries Framework has been operationalized merely to protect fishery yields, not to protect ecosystems or the cultural and biological diversity that depends on them. Maximum sustained yield, which is the key decision metric under this policy, is about 30% of the historical biomass for most species. And under the Sustainable Fisheries Framework, there's no intention of rebuilding fish stocks above that very low bar. And really what this creates is an entrenching of what's called a shifting baseline, or a normalizing of a depauperate world. And I'm just going to give you one example of why I believe this to be the case. And I'm going to go back to yellow-eye rockfish. Basically the biomass of yellow-eye rockfish today is only about 2/3 of the original biomass prior to the onset of commercial fisheries. Most of the decline happened around from the 1980s on, and this coincides with that very rapid increase in commercial fisheries. As you can see, as illustrated in this image in the top right, yellow-eye rockfish are very important predators. They eat smaller fish, and through an ecological process called trophic cascades, by being predators of mid-sized fish, they probably have a strong influence in the diversity of smaller prey eaten by the mid-level fish. So, we can probably expect that wherever yellow-eye rockfish thrive, biodiversity enhance. But when you have this kind of decline, you can probably expect the ecosystem to be quite destabilized. And also, as shown in the photograph in the lower right, there's all sorts of cultural practices associated with species like yellow-eye rockfish. this is a photograph of a potlatch in which many species were served, but that included yellow-eye rockfish. So certainly the lower access to these traditional foods brings quite a bit of a cultural and economic hardship to communities. So if you were a DFO manager, trying to, implement ecosystem-based fishery management, you'd probably be in a hurry to do something about this kind of decline. But it turns out that after this 2/3 decline from the original biomass, that yellow-eye rockfish are about the green line, which is biomass at 80% of maximum sustained yield, which means that they're solidly in the healthy zone. So there's no rebuilding plan that's required. And fisheries can continue with the higher catches allowed for the healthy zone. For real alarm bells to be rung, yellow-eye would have to decline below this red line, which is 40% of the biomass at maximum sustained yield. And that would necessitate them to drop from for almost 90% relative to the pre-fishery abundance. Now, even though I've used rockfish as an example, I do want to emphasize this is exactly the sort of framework that's used to manage other species, including cultural and ecological keystones like salmon. So it really is a very broad issue of concern. So the question becomes, how might we shift course and head somewhere more holistic? So my colleague Will Atlas and I recently gave it a stab at coming up with an answer to this, or at least an initial answer to generate discussion. And we proposed a revision to how the implementation of the Sustainable Fisheries Framework, which we published recently in an open source publication called Policy Options. And our suggestion for the revision was really simple. It's really all simply about taking the status quo and grabbing these lines that are down here and moving them up here. So in the revised healthy zone, to enter that revised healthy zone, fish would have to be at about 80% of their historical biomass. Which is very different than being at 80% of the biomass and maximum sustained yield. And then the critical zone would start at what's currently would go up here, which is what's currently considered to be the low end of the healthy zone. So two things happen here. Three things happen. One is it's a lot more difficult for any stocks to be in the healthy zone. But there's this very much wider cautious zone where there's a lot of scope to implement different catch levels that might allow a fishery to continue while still promoting a recovery into a healthy zone, a revised healthy zone. And the other thing is that alarm bells start ringing a lot earlier with this higher level for entering the critical zone. So really what this is about, it's about revising how we manage fisheries in a way that's more consistent with restoring and maintaining biodiversity, resilient ecosystems, indigenous traditions, but also much broader intrinsic values that I think all of us who live in this beautiful country can relate to. And I think this kind of revision to Will Atlas and I proposed is realistic for at least three reasons. And the first is that there's nothing in current policy that keeps historical baselines from being used as a means to evaluate the status of stocks. And there are examples such as that of rock sole, in which DFO fishery scientists, who I think are excellent at what they do, have taken the initiative and used some level of historical baseline to assess stocks. So I think that means that there's quite a bit of scope of collaboration with DFO scientists to come up with a better way to implement the policy. The other reason why I'm optimistic about changing things is that indigenous knowledge often can provide longer and more meaningful historical baselines that give us a reference point to the true state of stocks. So in this example, I'm showing some collaborative work that we did with Central Coast Nations and the University of Victoria, in which the knowledge from traditional fishers reconstructed the sizes of yellow-eye rockfish over time. And what's basically what happened is we were able to get a sense of the sizes of fish, or an estimate of sizes of fish that went back into the 1950s, which is about 50 years earlier than when scientific surveys began in the area. So this totally changes your perspective, because if you start studying fish only in the 2000s, you assume that this is the normal size at about 40 centimeters on average. But once you start looking at the longer perspective prior to the much bigger commercial fishery, before the commercial fisheries really started removing all the big fish, you realize that fish have shrunk in size by half. And that is quite an alarm bell, because it is the larger females are disproportionately more fecund than the smaller females. And also larger individuals as top predators have a stronger ecological role that likely contributes to enhancing biodiversity. So this is the kind of knowledge that I think is, give us much more substantive historical baselines to, set our restoration goals for fish populations. But the final reason why I think that revisions to the Sustainable Fisheries Framework are realistic, it really comes down to politics. I mean, politics have been changing in the sense that First Nations are regaining some of the, their power in decision making, and are starting to become strong players at different tables with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And specifically in 2019, 14 First Nations, including those from the Central Coast, signed what's called the Fisheries Resources Reconciliation Agreement. And this provides the framework for collaborative governance of fisheries, in which both Canada and First Nations are levels of government responsible for drafting fishery management plans. And more importantly, I mean, it creates the possibility for shifting the dominant management paradigm and imbuing it with holistic views about fish that are grounded in deeper historical understanding and in indigenous knowledge and ecology. Now, some of you might be thinking all along, well, all this stuff about historical baselines is so fine and good, but what about climate change? And yeah, that's a good one. I mean, we have, globally, oceans are warming, oxygen levels are dropping, oceans are acidifying, and that means that we can, different species are shifting their distributions along latitudes, they're shifting the distributions along depths. And the other thing that's, interesting is that as the oceans warm and lower and lose their oxygen levels, the metabolic rates of fish change, which means that they're constrained in what their maximum size can be. So really the point here is that, the ecosystems are changing and they're going to continue to do so, but that doesn't mean that we have to lose our deep historical perspective. The point is that we have to strive to keep understanding change over time and to manage fisheries in ways that maintain the historical range of variability to the extent possible, while acknowledging these broader global changes. And what it really comes down to is maximum sustained yield, or 30% of the historical baseline, is just too low a bar, even under climate change. And we can do way better than that. So in closing, my closing message is that I think we're at the cusp of multiple opportunities to shift the current management paradigm and start treating fish not as commodities, which is something we've been doing for far too long since industrial fisheries and other aspects of colonialism began, but rather to start treating them for the essential components of the social and ecological systems that sustain us. I mean, that's what fish really are. And whether we use these opportunities to do better in fishery management, I think it really comes down to how we decide to answer these two questions collectively as a society. Thanks very much.
Snapshot, if you will, during this century in the human experience, or a couple of centuries in the human experience. Thank you for a delightful, very engaging talk. And of course, we've got an audience here. We have questions coming in. I'm going to start off with hopefully what is a fairly straightforward one. We obviously have a biologist in the crowd. You mentioned that rockfish can be as old as 205 years. How do you determine that? How do you determine the age of a fish?
Yes, so the ear bone of rockfish accumulates annual growth rates, very much like trees do. So you collect the ear bone, and it goes to a lab where people specialize in this, and they basically cut the ear bone, or the proper name is otolith, and count the rings in the otoliths, and that's how fish are aged. For some species you have to use scales, but in rockfishes it's through the otolith.
Great, thank you. So you had mentioned some rather dismal, bleak examples of how not to manage fisheries, and you'd also mentioned some tantalizing good news examples of how to manage fisheries. So I wonder, given where we are today and given what we know to be the case with various fish stocks today, are there any really good examples of stocks that have been managed well or are now being managed well? And I think you mentioned a couple of examples there, but if you could just illustrate for us, maybe from your toolbox, your experience, and your understanding of fisheries management largely in the 20th century. What are some examples?
Yeah. So I'd say we're in a transition point, and which there's very important signs of optimism. And herring might be a good example in the sense that there's been a lot of mismanagement in the past. There's been a lot of conflict between DFO and First Nations in the management of herring. But as a result, there's more discussion, and fisheries scientists from DFO have been quite willing to start engaging with First Nations. And so some of the ongoing work, and this is still preliminary, but some of the ongoing work is, rather than using something like maximum sustained yield metrics, is looking at past years in which herring abundance was high as the reference point for evaluating. So that's very much going along the lines of what I'm suggesting. And the other thing that's interesting about herring is First Nations have been very clear for a long time that there's not a single monolithic stock of herring along their coasts. They're very locally adapted. So what happens with herring in specific spawning areas at a very small scale is not necessarily reflective of what's happening in the big picture. So First Nations are asking for management at that much smaller spatial scale, and that is actually being explored by DFO scientists in collaboration with First Nations. And if you see at the lack of communication from DFO in the past, I think this is quite a sign of optimism, and hopefully it'll keep going and end up leading to substantive policy changes in management.
Great, thanks. And of course, many fish we look at through our own commercial or food, social, ceremonial, or recreational eyes. And talking about herring just reminds me of how important that forage fish is to so many different other species, whether it's seals and sea lions, whether it's rockfish, as you're talking about in an example today. Herring really is an important currency in the coastal food chain here. So thank you for that example. I have another question here from the audience. The graph showing the small threshold for the cautious zone does need to change to that wider proposed version. How can we start shifting the paradigm out there to change how we harvest these species? And is there a role for young biologists to play in leading this shift?
Yeah, excellent question. So the public voicing of my ideas and ideas I've shared with Will Atlas and Coastal First Nations of how to change this management thresholds is relatively recent. So what I'm hoping that does is trigger a broader dialogue with DFO scientists, and in which we actually say, well, maybe we can go to the drawing board, back to the drawing board together, and start shifting these management thresholds. Unfortunately, it's going to come down more to how higher levels of management respond to that. But through my more one-on-one discussions with BFO scientists, they're quite willing to engage in coming up with ways to do it. So we're at an early stage. Maybe we should check in a year or so from now to see how it develops. Now, about the role of young biologists, I think that's crucial. I mean, I have a 16-year-old daughter. She's not necessarily going to be a biologist, but what I see in general in younger generations is much greater willingness to get out of the status quo and be bolder in the thinking and just do what's going to really give us a better world. So if there's any young biologists out there, and if the sort of topics I spoke about resonate with you, I certainly encourage you to get the higher training that's required. I mean, working for in DFO science and infiltrating that with talent and young ideas, it's exactly the sort of thing that I think will bring change. We also need to infiltrate managers, management as well. So if you have an interest in being at the higher policy level and with bringing fresh blood to that, it's definitely very much needed.
Always good to encourage these current and future generations to get involved in a good, sustainable manner. Thank you. From the audience here, another comment and question. Great talk. How did you determine historical biomass for a single species of rockfish? I once had to do a population modeling assignment. I really struggled to find historic catch data for individual species. For example, rockfish were all grouped together.
Yes, that's a great question. So, and that's why I had the one slide in which I wanted to highlight how difficult assessing fish populations in general is. So, but to get the historical baseline, the more common approach in fisheries management is to take your estimate of current fish abundance, and then you back calculate by looking very specifically at how fast the species grow, what its natural mortality is, its reproductive rate, all sorts of really key life history characteristics. And then they have to reconstruct the catch. So there's all sorts of assumptions that go into it. It's always the best guess. But that has been, from a scientific perspective, that's the essence of it. Now, from an indigenous knowledge perspective, which can be, from a more traditional way or from a local being on the water over, constantly. I mean, it comes down to more direct observations that are perhaps more qualitative, but there are ways of working with qualitative observations to ground truth some of the estimates, or to, as I showed with the example of changing sizes of yellow-eye rockfish, to establish information that otherwise would not exist at all.
Great, thank you. Of course, lots of challenges in there, lots of opportunities for people to get involved and explore this complicated world that we live in. I have another question here from the audience. Is there any indication that in the future MSY will be calculated in relation to other environmental changes, such as climate change?
Yeah, great question. So from talking to my DFO colleagues, it is something that they're trying to bring more into the stock assessment models. I mean, it would be quite naive and irresponsible to not start explicitly bringing climate change into projections of fish stocks. So yes, that is the growing trend. It hasn't quite been used too widely yet, but that's another transition point that we're in right now.
Great, difficult one. And this one is a little bit related, but perhaps coming from a different perspective, this might add to the way in which you answer that. Are there other stressors such as industrial development other than extractive fisheries that could be considered when managing fisheries? How do you manage such a complex system?
Certainly in some parts of the world that are closer to industrial development, that would be the case. I mean, especially when you get into areas where there might be, oil development or, transforming of, well, certainly with salmon, I mean, through loss of riparian habitats, spawning habitats. So yeah, there are other stressors to continue. My emphasis on climate change in the presentation here is because that is so ubiquitous. It will affect every single species of concern. So it's not a big stretch to make a generalized statement about it. But then when you get into more specific species, for example, deep water rockfishes, you're probably not going to be too worried about habitat change for the most part, with some exceptions. I mean, destruction of coral reef, deep water corals of glass sponges will affect them. But most rocky habitats are not going to be, affected by industrial development. But estuaries that affect salmon, absolutely. Yeah, in that case, it would be very important.
Terrific. Another question here. You're getting lots of questions, Alejandro. So your student.
It's always a good sign.
It's a very good sign. Thank you. So here, can you expand on the impact of larger females on potential reproductive success? Or in brackets, larger number of larvae released over a longer period of time, close brackets, and how this could help with the recovery of rockfish stocks.
Right. So I didn't want to get too technical during the talk, but basically the relationship between body size and fecundity is not a one-on-one. It's not linear. It's a power relationship. So in technical terms, it accelerates as females get larger, their fecundity gets disproportionately greater, and I think let me see if I can remember the numbers. I have this example in the book, but a female quillback rockfish that has reached its maximum body size is going to be putting out about, I think it's something like 800,000 or something live larvae per reproductive event. And a female that is only about 10 centimeters smaller than that is going to be putting, maybe 10-20% of those live larvae out. So it really is quite a loss of reproductive potential when you remove the large individuals. Now, I mentioned that I had some caveats about the technical accuracy of stock assessment models. And one of them is that in Canada, for some reason that let's say we've been having this discussion whenever I'm a reviewer and in stock assessment meetings. They do not incorporate that change in this size-specific fecundity into the stock assessment models. It is way more difficult. I mean, it's already hard enough to do the job they're doing, but in the United States, like in the management of West Coast groundfish, they're quite advanced in implementing size fecundity relationships into their stock assessment. And there's some work that they've done there that basically shows that you can really underestimate stock abundance, and if you don't do that. You can underestimate the risk of depleting the stock if you don't do that. So I'm hoping that that's another thing that improves in the near future.
Great, thank you. Another question here. Are there thoughts or ideas about how to keep commercial fisheries profitable or viable if minimum baselines change in legislation or regulation? A change to a wider range of caution seems to imply a need for reducing catch.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'm glad it's being asked, because I do have to put it in context. I mean, I personally have friends who are commercial fishers, and in some of the marine protected area network planning, I've had great discussions with commercial fisheries. So I definitely don't. They're not something abstract to me. They're humans making a living, and which it's definitely very important to keep in mind. So I think a number of things need to happen. There's a lot of the catch is taken by very large corporations owning a lot of licenses, and that reduces the the actual profit of individual fishers. So some kind of a downscaling of how licensing is done. That it's not so much done by large corporations, but done more by smaller scale individuals. So that you can basically end up catching less fish without without substantial declines in income. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but that's somewhere where economists, I think, can do a lot more work in the changing to how licensing is done. And the other thing is there's a fair amount of waste in the system as well. So I think by reducing waste, profits can stay up while catching less fish. And I mean, and in the end, it will be to the benefit of commercial fishers to be able to do this for longer and longer, rather than end up facing another Atlantic cod event, and more broadly in the near future. And I think between some of the caveats I brought about climate change, about removing the large females, I mean, it's not impossible that this could be happening for some stocks again.
Terrific. And a related question here, how can we best approach a shift, such as the one you propose, given the current tensions in the fishing industry, and especially when one sees what is happening on the East Coast in Nova Scotia recently?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm certainly aware of the situation in the East Coast, although, I mean, I guess I'll stick to my experience here on the West Coast, because I feel I'm a little grounded in understanding that one. So I think a real test of how willing we are as a society to change is how these co-governance arrangements with First Nations proceed. If they end up being, just another platitude in which they're keeping First Nations busy without substantially incorporating their views into things like fishery management, then it's not going to be very good. But if, as a society, we're willing to, go beyond the platitudes and make some changes that allow them to, allow First Nations governance to have broader implications, I do think that that will precipitate a much better change. And the other thing is, everybody as a citizen has a role to play in this by participating in public processes, communicating with with our elected politicians on the sorts of changes, we want to make. I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to be implementing the change. You just have to be a concerned citizen and make your voice heard for wanting things to be different.
Well, thanks very much, Alejandro, for a wonderful talk, a wonderful hour in conversation with our audience today and on the YouTube channel from this day forward. Delightful to hear what I would refer to as a tantalizingly optimistic presentation today, well-grounded in knowledge and expertise from different quarters here in the region. So thank you for that. I want to thank all the staff in our own Oceanwise Research Institute, and Danica and Amanda, of course, who helped to get us all together here online in a logical format today. I want to thank our sponsors, Sitka and North Family Foundations, for helping to make this journey worthwhile, fun, engaging, meaningful, and omnipresent. So thank you to our sponsors. Just a shout out to a return to normality after these 6 wonderful Ocean Award lectures over the past 6 weeks. Next Thursday, same time, same place. That means your living room or wherever you are today. We will be back to our online lectures, which we call the Tales from the Deep, sponsored here by your Oceanwise Research Institute team. And Amanda Weltman from our Ocean Biodiversity Research team will be presenting on reefs for rockfish. So Alejandro, please come back and join us for that one next Thursday at 1. Thank you for joining us today. Congratulations on an award well-deserved, and best wishes, best of luck in your personal and professional journey. And let's continue on this very interesting, challenging, difficult, heart-wrenching, but warm path to reconciliation with our coastal communities, indigenous communities, and biological communities. This is our story. So thank you for that, and take care.
Thank you.